It used to be, if you could build on your property, you could farm on your property, you could cut trees on your property, as long as you didn't hurt your neighbors. You can't do anything without getting permits from somebody. And with that kind of impediment, a lot of people who would otherwise build homes said, well, I'm going to do something else with my money.
James Burling is Vice President of Legal Affairs at the Pacific Legal Foundation and author of Nowhere to Live, The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis. What are the root causes of the apparent shortage of housing in America today? And why does Burling believe many housing-related proposals, from subsidies to certain zoning rules to rent controls, are actually counterproductive?
Well, the idea of having national rent control, as has been proposed by some people, is going to make a problem that is confined to the city into a national problem. And it's been a disaster wherever it's been tried.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. James Burling, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
It's great to be here.
So as we're filming, the first presidential debate just happened, and Vice President Harris mentioned a $25,000 subsidy for housing for new home buyers. So, and this is, I guess, tells us that there is some kind of issue in society. As you've been saying, there's a crisis, and I've been wondering, is there really a crisis? But apparently there is something going on. So tell me, what is happening?
It's a huge issue. People can no longer afford the way they used to rent or to buy a new home. It used to be the rule of thumb was you spend a third of your income on housing. Many people today are spending over half of their income on housing, which leaves little left for medical costs, for transportation, food, and the other essentials of life. And we've gotten ourselves into this problem gradually, slowly, but clearly we're in a problem that's a century in building of bad government policy after bad government policy, just making things worse and worse, and now we've hit the boiling point.
Well, I want to dig into that, like just kind of the whole picture that you develop in your book. Before we go there, let's talk about some of these policies that are being put on the table recently. Like, for example, this subsidy to get for new home buyers.
A subsidy is generally a terrible idea in the short term and especially in the long term. It's a terrible idea in the short term because all it does is shovel more money into a sector of the economy without necessarily increasing supply. And so when you shovel more money into a sector of the economy that doesn't increase supply, you have increase in costs. Costs are inevitably going to be going up if people are given $25,000 through their first down payment. If that happens, people will start raising prices to take that into a consideration that, hey, there's an extra $25,000, we can raise the cost of homes by a commensurate amount. In addition, a longer-term problem is once you start a subsidy like this, it's virtually impossible to get rid of these subsidies later on, even if you find out that you can't afford it. I mean, this $25,000 per person for a new home is estimated to cost in the next 10 years at least $100 billion. That's $10 billion a year. That's a lot of money. Where's the money going to come from? It's going to come from you and I, the taxpayers, and as a result, all other costs are going to go up as well. There's no such thing as free money. And so I'm very concerned that proposals like this is also just going to bankrupt part of the economy and cause prices to go up.
You know, these are typically described as kind of stopgap measures at a time when people are having difficulty to support them, right? Like you can imagine from the perspective of the buyer, hey, if I have a little bit of money, right, a little bit more money to buy a home, maybe I can actually do that.
Yeah, I have all kinds of sympathy for the home buyer trying to buy their first home. I mean, it is very difficult. But stopgap measures are never stopgap, as I alluded to a moment ago. They last forever. And second of all, it's not solving the problem of supply. It's just having more money chase the same number of homes that there was before. And supply and demand is an inexorable law, and you can't overturn it. I mean, people have tried. North Korea's tried to overturn it. Venezuela's tried to overturn it. And even the California legislature's tried to overturn the law of supply and demand. It just doesn't happen.
You know, it strikes me that there is a model
of this kind of happening, I guess, when it comes to, the cost of education. Is that, would you say that's
it's a very
analogous?
good, it's a very good analogy, because higher education, what we saw is the government, federal government, shoveling all kinds of money into higher education. And as a result, universities and colleges started on spending sprees. Where there used to be dormitories, there are now these castles, these luxury residences that people can't afford before they go to college and can't afford afterwards. But when they're in college, they're in the lap of luxury. And after a while, the government funding starts to dry up a little bit. So you have all kinds of student loans, but the price of tuition has gone up and up and up in universities and colleges far faster than the rate of inflation. And this is because you have so much money washing around from the federal government in the process. As soon as there's any kind of fiscal issue, the students have to pay back the student loans, which is increasingly difficult. So then the taxpayers are supposed to come in and subsidize this process even more directly than they were before. This doesn't solve the problem of the quality of education. It doesn't solve the problem of availability of education. All this money just increases the cost of the education we have. And if nothing else, it makes it worse, because now on our university campuses, we not only have professors and a few administrators, we have an army of bureaucrats overseeing the federalization of higher education. The same thing is going to be in housing. If you start putting all kinds of money in it, whether it's $25,000 for new home buyers, or the other proposal to have $40 billion for subsidies for home builders, all this money washing around is going to create great distortions to the market, and it's going to be increasingly difficult for the ordinary Joe to go out and find a home that he or Josephine can afford.
Well, so let's shift gears a tiny bit and just talk about some other policies that are in discussion right now. One of them is, challenges to the single-family zoning policies. So what do you think about that?
I think that we need to rethink our zoning laws. This is one of the things I talk about in great length in my book, Nowhere to Live, because zoning started out in America on a very dark side. Of first zoning law in America came in 1910 in Baltimore, when George McMetchen, a Yale-educated attorney, and his schoolteacher wife decided to buy a home commensurate with their success in life as an attorney and a schoolteacher. George McMetchen bought a home in Baltimore in a very nice neighborhood called Utah Place. Within several days of buying that home, local youths came to his property and essentially rioted, taking rocks and throwing them and destroying and cutting down every window in the house and the skylight. Why? They were incensed that George McMetchen had bought this house, because George McMetchen was all black and the neighborhood was all white. Baltimore soon followed up with the nation's first zoning law that made it a crime for a black person to move into a white neighborhood, or subject him to a fine of $3,000 in current dollars, or a year in jail. This was the first zoning law we had in America. Now, the Supreme Court struck down a very similar law that came out of Louisville, Kentucky in 1917. That case was brought by a white real estate dealer and the head of the local NAACP, and they argued this is a violation of our property rights. This is a violation of our economic rights, and the court agreed. So I think property rights are very important. Now, zoning continued after that, though, in a different form. It was not racial zoning, but economic zoning, which had pretty much the same effect. And by economic zoning, I mean you have areas of the city that are laid out for residential and others for businesses, and ne'er the twain should meet, but also the residential areas often excluded multifamily housing. It excluded apartments, it excluded triplexes, duplexes, and even boarding homes. And that made it impossible for working class people to live in the nice suburban areas outside of cities. Euclid, Ohio had a ordinance that was modeled on one out of New York City. The New York City ordinance was designed to keep Jews from having garment factories on Fifth Avenue. It sounds awful, but that's what it was for. And the one in Euclid, Ohio was designed to keep the immigrants out by banning all apartments. This went also to the Supreme Court. And here the Supreme Court had a change of heart. And the Supreme Court said, look, apartment buildings in a residential neighborhood are nuisances. They're kind of like a pig in the parlor instead of the barnyard. Now, I don't know if the court was thinking that the term pig also meant a Polish American at the time, but clearly the court was concerned about immigrants and working class people moving into nice suburban neighborhoods like the members of the court lived in, and it upheld that ordinance. Ever since, zoning, single family zoning, has taken over in America, and it has made it virtually impossible today, especially, that working class and new families starting out can afford a home in many, many neighborhoods in this country. So when we talk about single family zoning, you have to think about the history, and you have to think about what it does today, even if we no longer think about zoning in terms of keeping out working class people or keeping out minorities. That is the effect that it has. So people are talking about the need to reform single family housing in various ways. And it could be allowing duplexes where there are single family homes, or triplexes or small apartments. There are lots of things that could be done to make housing more accessible through better zoning or elimination of bad zoning in many cases.
We're going to take a quick break right now, James.
Okay.
And we'll be right back. And we're back with James Burling, author of Nowhere to Live, The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis. Well, you seem to know an astonishing amount about this. Of course, you know, there's very much in your book. But tell me a little bit about your background before we jump to some other policies, because, you know, this has kind of been your life.
It has been my life, but I had a life before this, if you will. I used to be, before I was a lawyer, a productive member of society, I like to say. I was an exploration geologist, and I climbed up and down hills all over the West looking for deposits of gold, silver, molybdenum, and copper. And I thoroughly enjoyed that. But in that experience, I ran into a lot of bureaucrats, federal bureaucrats in particular. And I was appalled by the power that they exercised, which was extra legal. That is, they didn't have legal authority to tell me what I should do or could and couldn't do. And I thought, this is ridiculous. We should sue these people. Well, my boss in the mining company didn't want to sue anybody. And I said, well, I'm going to go to law school so I can fight bureaucrats. And so I went to law school, and I have been fighting bureaucrats for the last 40 years. And it's not only in mining or environmental laws, but all kinds of things dealing with people trying to build homes and being stymied by all levels of regulation at the state and local and federal levels.
What would be the most significant case, would you say, for you personally that you participated in? Maybe let's talk about one that you won, and maybe one that you didn't win.
So I'll talk about one that I won first, because then I hope we can forget about the one that I lost, or ones that I've lost, because I've lost a number of cases, of course. In 40 years it happens. But the most significant case that I had was representing Anthony Palazzolo, who was a owner of a small wrecking yard and tow truck operator. And he had a little bit of money that he set aside, and he bought about 20 acres of property in Rhode Island along the coast, not right on the beach, but on a big pond in the area. And his hope was to develop that property. And he bought it as part of his corporate ownership, and he had a little corporation. He's the only owner of the corporation, the sole corporation. And he tried to develop it year after year after year. Eventually, he said, I'm not going to try houses, I'll do a beach club, just a parking lot, some shade structures, and some bathrooms that people can use. And then the families, when the water is too rough in the ocean, they can come to the pond and enjoy themselves. Rhode Island turned down the permit because, in its words, this was going to advance a private interest rather than a public interest. Now, Anthony Palazzolo was loaded for bear, because when he started having problems with the state of Rhode Island, he wrote to the legal publishing company called West and said, send me everything you have on property rights. And they did. And he read it. His son later would tell the story, you know, when I was growing up, my friends' parents, they would talk to their kids and their fathers about football and baseball. My father talked to me about the Magna Carta and about the Constitution. And so when Anthony sued, saying that his property had been taken for a public use without being paid, he thought he could win his case. And he had his own private attorney in Rhode Island, and he lost case after case. And eventually the Rhode Island Supreme Court said, look, you've had this property so long, you knew that there were regulations in place, and you knew the regulations are getting harsher and harsher. You bought this property, or you know, knowing that this regulatory scheme was in place. Next case, please. And and Anthony got together with us, and I took on the case and went to the U.S. Supreme Court with it. And Rhode Island was arguing, and it was Attorney General Sheldon Whitehouse at the time that argued the case for Rhode Island. And I argued that Anthony Palazzolo had the same rights to sue for a regulatory taking of his property as anybody, regardless of when he bought the property in terms of when the regulations went into place. The rights in property don't disappear with the passage of time. And the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, agreed with us, and an opinion by Anthony Kennedy wrote that future generations too have the same rights in property as the present ones, and they can sue. So I think this is critically important for the idea that property rights really do not diminish in time simply because you have more and more regulations. So I think these are the sort of precedents that when I'm with Pacific Legal Foundation, that just really help a lot of people. Now, you asked about cases I lost. You still want to ask that question?
Well, absolutely. Well, it's also interesting because I think in your book, the erosion of property rights is kind of the central theme. I mean, you argue that is the unifying principle behind all the problems with housing, right?
Absolutely. Because time after time, people have had the right to use property taken away for various reasons. And another case that I have, it's kind of a heartbreaking case in some way, was representing O.C. Mills and his son Kerry. They had a small plot of land outside of Pensacola, Florida. And they wanted to build a little cabin, fishing cabin for his son. And to do that on this little, quarter-acre or less lot, he started putting sand on the property. EPA came out and said, stop, you're filling wetlands. And he thought that was absurd because these lands were dry. What do you mean wetland? Well, he got another letter from the EPA saying, stop right now. He stopped. He went to the state and said, because he thought, well, EPA, they're sharing the same office building. If I talk to people in the state that I know, they'll come out and help me. And they did. They came out and they actually drew a line in the sand and said, on this side, wetland, no touch. This side, you can develop it. So he began to bring in some more sand and clearing the land. The next thing that he knew, he was being arrested. And he thought this was so absurd, he could just go to court and tell his story. He didn't have an attorney when he started out, and he ended up losing his case, and he spent 18 months in federal prison with his son because he filled a wetland. But the irony of this case is, after he got out of federal prison for filling this wetland, he had to clear it, so he took the sand off. And then the EPA said, you haven't taken enough off, it's not wet enough. And he went back to court. This time he had an attorney and a different judge. This judge went out to look at the property and said, yeah, you've taken enough sand off, but really, this is an Alice in Wonderland scenario. I don't think this is wetland to begin with. And you're basically going to prison for putting dry sand on, clean dry sand on a sandy area. And the judge thought that was absurd. So that's what I came into the case trying to get his conviction reversed. Because having the conviction, he had limits on his ability to hunt with guns. He had limits on his ability to vote and all the other things that felons, federal felons have, their rights are forever limited. And we tried to get his conviction overturned on the basis of what the second judge had found. And unfortunately, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals said it was too late. He should have brought these arguments better, in a better way when he was in trial court the first time, and it's too late to overturn his conviction. So that was a disappointment. But the key to housing in this case is that you have such power of the federal government over individuals. The federal government can say, don't touch your own property. Don't put anything on it, not even clean sand, or you may go to prison. That's a terrible impediment for people to build homes, and it's a terrible incursion on their private property rights. It used to be, if you could build on your property, you could farm on your property, you could cut trees on your property, as long as you didn't hurt your neighbors. And now The federal government, the state government, local governments are your partners in anything you do to your property. You can't do anything. You can't, say boo without getting permits from somebody.
I guess the big question is, what was the rationale in the development of all these regulations? I mean, presumably it's with, population size increasing and needing to, protect, vulnerable habitat or things.
Yeah. Well, certainly we developed an environmental ethic in the 1970s, and it makes sense. We have to start paying attention to the environment we live in, and we have to protect it. But there has to be a balance in what we do. And this is something I argue in my book, that when we simply blindly take vast areas of land off the table for development, whether it's for wetland, endangered species habitat, viewshed corridors, agricultural preservation zones, all these things take very large amounts of land off the table without considering what is the impact on housing, what is the impact on affordability, what is the impact on future generations who may need this land for some purpose or other if it's taken off the table under threat of going to federal or state prison. And this is a balance that's been lost. This is the debate that we should be having about, well, how much environmental protection is enough, and what are the costs of environmental regulation? People used to think, I think, that it was free. You just regulate something and you don't develop property and there's no cost to society. Well, there should be payments to the people whose land can't be used, and that's one thing we've argued for years at Pacific Legal Foundation. But there's also the social cost of increase in price of housing that has been a result of this and many other regulatory programs. And so, what I argue in Nowhere to Live, the hidden story of America's housing crisis, is that we really need to reconsider the regulatory oversight that we have on home building to make it easier for people to, if they have land and it's time that the family farm isn't working out anymore because the commodity prices have changed or the city's growing up next to me, that I ought to have the ability of building some homes on that property. But that right is diminished so much now that people are not doing that, and it's causing a huge distortion in the market and increase in prices.
Any final thoughts as we finish, James?
The crisis we're in, and I do think it's a crisis, is something that is not inevitably permanent. We can get out of it. In the past, we've had waves of immigrants in the 19th century, and we built our way out of the housing crisis then. We can do it again, but we have to focus on the regulations that are important, but at the same time recognize that too much regulation just makes it impossible for people to build the homes where people want to live.
Well, James Burling, it's such a pleasure to have had you on the show.
It's been my pleasure to be here.
Thank you all for joining James Burling and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.